I think it's a little bit of both, to be honest. On the one hand, the U.S. and Israel have a very close and ongoing strategic partnership, and there is very much a meeting of the minds between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. So I think there's less reason for President Trump to feel like he's compelled to come to Israel as part of his tour, even as there's a great deal that he wants to accomplish that concerns Israel, because it has to do with trying to create the framework for a broader Israeli normalization with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for example. So the relationship with Israel, I think, is going strong, but there's little concrete things that he can accomplish in terms of practically showing up in Israel. And there's much more to do in the Persian Gulf. I think that's one angle. There's another angle that says that at precisely the time when there is uncertainty about Israel's future war aims, the Israeli government just articulated plans for a renewed offensive in the Gaza Strip. It's very clear that there's also a little bit of drift on the part of the United States and Israel. The two countries are very much aligned on a number of things, but recent moves, the start of negotiations with Iran, the separate de-escalation deal that Washington has hammered out with the Houthis in Yemen, all of this suggests that Washington is coordinating at least a little bit less closely with Jerusalem in terms of its regional security policy. So I think all three things are playing a role. But they have combined, they have conspired to inform the decision about why not to go to Israel during this tour. I'm not sure it's a full policy reset, but it's very clear that there are differences that are beginning to creep into the relationship. One is on Iran and the prudence of nuclear negotiations, another is on the Houthis. The president's recent announcement of de-escalation with the Houthis has suggested that as long as the Houthis stand down and don't attack American commercial vessels in the Red Sea, then the United States will be satisfied. This really decouples Israeli and American security in a way that I think is rebounding very negatively in the Israeli public sphere. So this is the context that the secretary's trip was scheduled during, and that's why symbolically, maybe not substantively, but symbolically, it was very important. And its cancellation, I think, is going to lead to even more questions in Jerusalem about the durability of the relationship. I think there's a real sense, and I just came back from a trip to the region, which included a stop in Israel, and it was very clear to me from my conversations with officials and scholars in Israel that there's a sense of drift there. A year ago, the strategic situation was objectively much worse. Israel hadn't started its Northern Front campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon yet. It hadn't retaliated the second time against Iranian ballistic missile firings the way it did in October. And so strategically, the situation was more difficult. But in terms of morale, in terms of clarity of vision, everything was much clearer a year ago than it was now, just in the last few days when I talked to folks there. There's a real sense of uncertainty about what the objectives that the Israeli government is trying to achieve in Gaza are going to be. It's not clear that the new plan for a military offensive, which includes occupation of parts of Gaza, is going to achieve the desired outcome. And remember, the desired outcomes are twofold. The Netanyahu government has talked about removing Hamas from power and also the return of the hostages. And it's not clear that the current Israeli government strategy is going to achieve either one or the other. And it's also going to very clearly create a sort of a very big both moral and psychological and even economic toll on the country, because it's going to require, and it's already beginning to happen, a call up of a very significant number of reserve soldiers in the Israeli military. And Israel is now in the 19th month of this conflict. Its resources are stretched. Its society is riven by divisions. And this new added military strategy, military initiative, and objective, I think is going to put further strain on both the political system and on the Israeli government and the way it's negotiating this strategy. As you can probably imagine, this was very much the topic of almost every conversation I had when I was in Israel. And it's clear that from the Israeli perspective, this is a mixed bag. Israel, on the one hand, very much wants a non-military solution to the Iranian nuclear program, nuclear will to power. And so if there is some sort of negotiations, the Israelis are not writing this off out of hand. The Israelis think that it is possible to hammer out a new deal and a deal that preserves their security. However, the shifting parameters of those negotiations, the lack of clarity about whether Iran is going to be able to maintain domestic enrichment capability, whether or not we're simply going back into a deal that looks very much like the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, I think is raising a lot of concerns among policymakers in Jerusalem, mostly because that deal was seen as too weak and too narrow and too limited to really accomplish Israel's strategic objectives. And that deal has really, I think, instilled in Israeli officials the understanding that there may come a time that Israel may need to act directly, may need to act militarily to eliminate Iran's nuclear program. The problem that Israel has is because of the strength and the extent of the relationship with the United States, Israel doesn't have the freedom to act in that way as long as those negotiations are ongoing. So right there, you can see the problem that Israel has because it feels constrained by the ongoing negotiations and by what America may think. And you can also see the makings of the Iranian strategy because as far as the Iranians are concerned, they're advantaged if the talks go on longer, if there's more and more American investment in the talks, that will have the effect of constraining Israel's ability to act independently. One of the remarkable things that you've seen over the last 8 months or so has been a real Israeli-led dismantlement of the so-called ring of fire that Iran had tried to build around the Jewish state in preceding years. If you look at the state and the health of the Iranian proxy network, it's in much worse shape now than it was just half a year ago in terms of Hezbollah capabilities, in terms of Hamas capabilities, in terms of the removal of the Assad regime, which was a key state-based proxy that Iran had enjoyed and nurtured for decades. So the ring of fire, the proxy network, is in worse shape, a significantly worse shape now than it was half a year ago. However, this doesn't mean that the Iranian regime is not trying to reconstitute Hezbollah capabilities. It's not trying to reconstitute and rearm Hamas capabilities and make other advances as well. So this is very much, I think, a topic to watch. It's not correct to say that the threat from the proxy network has been eliminated, and this is very much a topic of concern in Jerusalem, and it should be a topic of concern here in Washington as well. Well, I think so. And it's interesting because the parameters of the deal have really shifted dramatically since October 7th, because the common understanding was that on the eve of October 7th, Riyadh and Jerusalem were just weeks away from some sort of normalization deal. And that deal didn't have as much or a significant component that involved the Palestinians. It revolved around trade normalization. It revolved around security guarantees from the United States. It revolved around all sorts of things that the Saudi government really needs in order to ensure its stability and prosperity in the region. Those factors are still there. there is still a Saudi desire to diversify its economy, a Saudi imperative to strengthen and bolster its security profile in the region, which involves an American commitment. And there's also the issue of the Saudi will to nuclear power, which is something that is evolving against the backdrop of Iran's progressing nuclear program. All those things are still present, and all those things are very much still on the table in terms of normalization, in terms of U.S.-Saudi and Saudi-Israeli relations. But over the last year and a half, we've seen the Saudis really take a very forward-leaning stance on the Palestinians. They have demanded as the price for normalization the idea that Israel would commit to a near-term establishment of a Palestinian state. The Israeli government right now simply can't do that because of the uncertainty relating to the future of Gaza, because of the security situation, and because the Israeli electorate after October 7th is less inclined to embrace a two-state solution than it was before. So for those reasons, the Israelis that I spoke with were less optimistic that Israeli-Saudi normalization is in the cards anytime soon. That doesn't mean that some sort of better relationship, some sort of thaw in the relationship isn't possible, but the hopes that everybody had a year and a half ago about a near-term normalization, I think they've receded somewhat. It is true that the Israeli government has rejected a role for the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip. And frankly, there are reasons for it to do that because of the Palestinian Authority's own weakness, because of rampant corruption in Ramallah. But the problem remains. Everybody understands that every war must end, and everybody understands that there needs to be some sort of governance structure for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And if the Israeli government is committed, as it seems to be, to removing Hamas from power, it has to have some ideas about how to fill that vacuum. It's not enough simply to say no. So that's one of the reasons that it's becoming very difficult for Saudi Arabia and for other countries to move beyond this discussion, this near-term discussion about the future of Gaza, and have a larger, long-term discussion about the future of the Palestinians, governance for the Palestinians. That's a conversation, frankly, that the Israeli government needs to foster, that needs to become more deeply engaged in. I think there's at least some, and it's clearly being driven by the Trump administration and the Trump administration's reassessment of its international engagement, that's leading not just to a change in the Trump administration's policy towards the Middle East generally and towards Israel specifically, but a whole series of changes in terms of how the United States relates to the world. But the fundamentals of the U.S.-Israeli strategic relationship remain strong. Israel is a security producer in the region. Israel is a strong ally. It has shared values with the United States. So the fundamental building blocks of the relationship are still sound. I can tell you from the Israeli perspective, a little bit more clarity and a little bit more alignment on issues like Iran and the Houthis would be very, very important. But I don't think many Israelis are questioning the core principles of the relationship. But they clearly see that there is a little bit of daylight that's beginning to creep in between Washington and Jerusalem.